most competitive Worldbox challenge yet. Me and 5 of my friends decided to create our own kingdoms. Each kingdom dividing the world by their own territory, spreading our own cultures, beliefs, and methods of warfare to find out who had the best method for running their kingdom. However, building amazing civilizations wasn't going to be easy, and there would be plenty of infighting and obstacles along the way. And as the ultimate test of who developed the most, upon year 20, every single kingdom will be allowed to declare war or alliances between one another, possibly creating an all-out global war. To find out who will come out victorious, sit back, relax, and pick a kingdom to root for, as I present to you the Worldbox Civilization experiment. The world was entirely divided into 6 factions. The pointy ears of Roice, the Ice Kingdom led by Kitty, the Thousand Suns led by me, Don't Mine at Night, the Dwarves led by Scream, the Strong Boys led by Multiverse, and my arch nemesis, the Thousand Gilfs led by Scribble. Each kingdom was given traits by their ruler to help them lead as best they could. Now that the kingdoms have been created and their people are being spawned in, it becomes immediately clear who has it the worst.
Yeah, you're right. There's not really much.
There's nothing here.
There's nothing here.
Nothing going on.
How is this terrible?
Something to eat. They can't.
There's nothing to eat. Nothing grows here besides pine trees, and there's no meat.
The orcs under the rule of Kitten inherit the frozen tundra, the biome of her choice, and out of the 3 traits that she gave them, one of them was fire resistance. Now, as many of you may have guessed, the frozen tundra is incredibly inhospitable. Not only do the denizens here suffer frost damage and occasionally freeze in place, causing them to be incredibly slow when building their civilization. However, this doesn't even include the very real possibility of starvation, as not only is there hardly anything to eat, but due to the frozen temperatures, plants and fruit do not spawn, making farming impossible. As you would imagine, at the start, it was a massacre, with tons of orcs dying prematurely, resulting in Kitten having the lowest population out of all the nations within the world at the time. Little did I know, Kitty, or rather the people she led, had something major planned. With that being said, that is yet to come, and we'll have to come back and check on Kitty and the Ice Kingdom another time. Now it's time to meet Don't Mine at Night, the kingdom of dwarves led by Scream. Scream decided to have them take root in one of the more populated continents, with resources being high, but with one major issue. The trees near his original camp were dead and didn't provide ample food, and to make matters worse, he was directly next to the borders of the Strong Boys, the kingdom led by Multiverse. His original plan was to expand into the lower section in order to take control of the vast resources, but in exchange, it made him vulnerable, putting him smack in the middle of 2 major countries. Despite this, I was surprised to find his people had already begun to make tents, and their numbers began to grow, showing that they were thriving in their new home. The Strong Boys weren't far behind, with them also setting up tents around a proper base. I also noticed how in comparison to the rivals, the Strong Boys already possessed some of the strongest warriors and were set up to have a powerful military. With their motto being Wah, there was no doubt in my mind that they would be a formidable kingdom. Next in line were the Thousand Gilfs led by Scribble, who were so far the most advanced out of all the known kingdoms, with them being the first to have proper housing and setting the groundwork to become a proper powerhouse. Due to their island being divided between crystal and the forest biome, they possessed a surprising amount of food and raw materials, creating a booming economy and rapid culture development in the crafts. Despite this, they were slightly on the lower end in terms of population, a downside due to the dwarves reproducing a bit slower in comparison to the other races. Further northwest were the Thousand Suns, a faction led by me. They were a group entirely of humans with the genius trait, along with resistance to both fire and ice. They were the second most advanced out of all of the kingdoms, with them being the second to develop proper housing. Along with them, many of the wildlife inherited similar traits, with the local animals also having above average intellect and sporting surprising resistance to the elements.
And apparently the insects here are geniuses.
However, upon looking at the individual members, I was grossly underwhelmed by what my sons had done so far.
Hey, what's up? And you're ugly.
Frick you.
We're not off to a great start.
To the
Just like in real life.
We're not off to a great start in terms of traits, I would say. We got greedy and we have infertile.
Infertile.
Lastly, further south were the pointy ears led by Roice, who had already managed to conquer most of the mushroom realm and had the highest population out of all of us. Interestingly enough, Roice decided to become a fertility god of sorts, and mainly only picked traits that in some way affected fertility. Due to their higher numbers and surprisingly good resources, they were incredibly advanced for the time and possessed housing for their entire population, while also using mushrooms as their main source of food to maintain their growth. In the meantime, I had also handpicked my ruler and decided to name them Magnus in hopes that he would lead his brethren to greatness. The 1,000 Gilfs, on the other hand, focused primarily on steady increases, their culture and resources steadily improving with time.
Are you saying that from a neutral standpoint, or are you hitting on them?
Both.
In comparison, the slowest to develop in terms of their level of technology was surprisingly the Strong Boys. Even after already having more than a decade worth of time, proper housing had still not been reached, and their numbers were relatively low, despite the size of their territory. Their neighbors weren't that far ahead either. However, they had at least developed a proper hall for group meetings and proper lodging. Despite this, however, they had some of the lowest numbers of citizens within the realm, and were the weakest in terms of their military. On the other end of the spectrum, much to my surprise, Kitty had begun to catch up with their rivals, her people beginning to develop housing, and even managed to reproduce fast enough to have a similar population to the other nations. With them having a decent number of houses, as well as having developed fishing boats, along with this, Kitty would be the next to name their king, giving him the title of Ice King to better fit the theme of their kingdom.
You said name him Ice King?
Yeah, I think.
So I thought you were gonna name him Simon.
I was, but she wants Ice King.
Yeah, it's the Ice Kingdom.
With the year 20 on the rise, tensions were becoming high, with many already plotting on who would be the first nation that had to be dealt with. In particular, my band of sons were considered targets by the other nations. Despite this, the ones who were closest to becoming enemies were the Dwarves of Screen and the Strong Boys of Multiverse, who, due to uncontrolled expansion, now shared a border and were now far more hostile because of it. With the Strong Boys recently finding out that painting things red made them faster, along with becoming bigger and smarter, made invasion practically imminent. Which it was. A few years passed, and the Strong Boys finally declared war on Screen's dwarves. The Don't Mind at Night Kingdom suspected this and already had a line of fighters at the border, hoping to deflect the orc invasion. During this, Roice had given his children the gift of fertility, allowing even more children to be born in the pointy-eared kingdom. The battle between Screen and Multiverse, later known as the War of the Sudden Clash, was terrible. Even though Screen possessed a larger military and even managed to ward off initial attacks, the orcs were relentless and eventually sent a massive horde near the border. Screen's troops, knowing there was no chance of survival, decided to have a final stand, fighting to a man and managing to take down a decent chunk of orcs with them. However, none of them would survive. Now having breached the border, the horde, which was led by the orc general Top, had managed to invade the capital city and began burning farms and buildings, destroying their food supply, which only hurt their numbers more. Smelling blood in the water, Kitty's orcs also declared war on the dwarves led by Screen, practically sealing their fates as a new tide of foes came crashing down upon them.
We're tired of being cold. Give us some of your war land.
For real.
They're rebelling against Kitty's stupid decision.
Our god won't help us.
At least that's what I would say, if the Ice Kingdom had a method of traveling there. It turned out that Kitty had not discovered proper war boats, and in fact, relied on other nations who had developed boats to allow proper trade, which was what allowed them to feed their entire population.
There's no boats.
They do not have boats.
They had fishing boats earlier. I thought they had
No, those aren't their boats. Those are our boats. We trade with them.
Oh my god, they
have
declared
no boats.
war while not having boats. They literally made binoculars, saw what was happening, and said, "We're declaring war on you." They're yelling across the sea. Meanwhile, Don't Mind at Night is Don't Mind at Night is hearing across the sea.
I mean, even without the Ice Kingdom's malice, the original capital city would still be demolished, with all men, women, and children being eradicated indiscriminately. The kingdom would survive a little longer, with the few who had survived the original onslaught migrating to the lower portions of the continent. However, the Strong Boys weren't far behind and quickly located and attacked the last city. Even with the invasion and the destruction of Screen's kingdom, Multiverse was not content and had begun forging an alliance with Scribble and the 1,000 Gilfs, under the condition that they attacked the 1,000 Sons soon after his war with Screen.
I'll form an alliance with you, if you agree to attack True. He's our
Learn to,
biggest competition right now.
I'm really
And like, as
not.
soon as
Like, I'm
my
not
guys
trying to hurt
learn
anybody.
yes, I'll agree to an alliance.
Alright, then we have an alliance.
Understanding the danger, I myself began to form an alliance with Roice, which was the best tactical move. The two of us were the largest kingdoms and shared many of our borders. If we did not form an alliance, we no doubt would have eventually come to blows, weakening both of our kingdoms greatly. Screen's empire would be the first to crumble, with all his citizens dead. Screen left, cursing all those who opposed him, claiming he hated everyone. It was a tragic day, with even other nations mourning the loss, myself included.
Being my ally.
What am I gonna do? I don't
You're
like
also
any of
Kitty's
you. Why would I
ally.
stick around?
I don't like
I will end it when they died.
I don't think a single one of you has ever genuinely been an ally to me in any of these Worldbox games. I'm gonna be completely honest
think
with
I
you.
When
was-
I gone.
Screen left?
Yeah.
Aw.
Yeah.
Going.
God dang it.
couldn't have.
Dude gets so salty about these things.
I mean, to be fair,
Yeah.
it was like he got clipped way too soon. Way too soon.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
However, this was just the beginning. Now with a power vacuum present and the War of the Sudden Clash being over, I was actually the first to make a move, creating a colony on the now entirely abandoned land. My sons were also preparing for war. My military was actually one of the largest at this time, and I controlled no small amount of land. However, everything would begin to crumble once it was the age of the sun. A time period in which massive heat waves and forest fires basically scorched the entire world. It was a time of strife and mass dehydration along with famine. Interestingly, Kitty was the least affected, as her people were in the tundra, allowing them to escape the worst of this age. Additionally, when given another choice, in order to better their odds, she gave them the gift of beauty instead of ice resistance yet again. Something that me and the other gods still found somewhat funny.
Help
Yeah.
Now what?
Like, please.
Make them attractive.
Help your people, they're starving.
Starving.
Along with this development, the Ice King would go on to forge an alliance with 1,000 Gilfs, forging the Crab Conclave. I had assumed that it would have been the Strong Boys to attack me first, but the Ice Kingdom would declare war shortly after. Luckily for everyone involved, I had actually managed to talk Kitty down, and we were able to broker a temporary peace between all parties involved. However, this was only temporary because the Strong Boys loathed the Age of Peace and heavily distrusted my motivations. During this time of peace, they would begin engineering new methods to improve warfare, and would finally manage to obtain proper boats, freeing up their ability to declare war on far-off nations that aren't directly connected to their original island.
Oh, I've got boats.
Who's got boats? Oh, crap, he actually has boats.
Me.
He's got boats.
Yeah. Now you're all in danger.
That took forever, but hey.
I think everybody.
We
everybody
have
has
fishing
boats. Now.
boats.
I think
Yeah.
everybody has boats.
Yeah.
Well, almost.
Against my better judgment, my sons would declare war on the Strong Boys. Despite my attempts to maintain peace, I knew that brokering a peace with the Strong Boys would be practically impossible, and as such, readied for war.
Ice
Kingdom Thousand
Kingdom.
Suns has declared war on the Strong Boys.
Scribble.
I'm here with you. Let's go.
All right.
Okay,
Yeah,
let's
let's
do this.
Let's dance.
Pointy
Let's
ears,
dance.
it's time.
Alliance for.
Hey, Kitty, you're technically in alliance with me. Remember?
Technically, no, I'm not.
Hey, you want to get destroyed at the rest of them? Sure, why not?
1,000 Gilfs, are you sure you want to get into this?
Duh.
All right, well, don't say I didn't give you
Murder.
an
We've
out.
got this.
I gave them an out. I offered peace, unity,
Who am I?
but I was denounced.
Who am I in
Oh,
alliance?
shut up, Magnus. Get ready, everyone, for the second burning of Prospero.
Oh no.
Whose turn is
Allying with Roice, we both took on the allied forces of the Strong Boys and the Thousand Gilfs. Thus began the War of Conquest. Knowing that the orcs would run their armies through the borders, my sons had stationed themselves within their own towns, near the Strong Boys. Knowing that the Strong Boys held the advantage in close range, my sons used bows to close the gap. Our military was in terms of numbers much larger, and were prepared to meet the orcs in combat. Kitty would decide to remain neutral while the war waged on, ignoring her original alliance with Multiverse. Roice would join in the war against the allied forces. However, there was an issue. His soldiers were stationed a continent away and would not be able to get to the battlefield until a few months, if not a year, had passed. I knew that if reinforcements came, the war was as good as ours. It was a fight against time. I had to hold out until he could come to secure the victory. It seemed that everything was going according to plan. My forces managed to push back the orc invasion and even killed their lead generals. However, it was all for nothing. Even though we managed to push back the orcs, Scribble had other plans. Rather than help defend his allies south, he loaded a ship with practically all of his military and shipped them into my territory. I had left a good portion of soldiers there, but the vast majority of my host was south invading the Strong Boys, which he took advantage of. Using their superior numbers, as well as weapons, they were able to cause a devastating blow. Civilians died by the hundreds, and they burned our homes and farms, severely damaging our supply lines in the process, which only hurt the war effort even more. Meanwhile, I couldn't send reinforcements, because upon invasion, my forces had been surrounded and promptly eradicated. I did not ever believe that they could have possibly been this deadly. And it all changed in that moment, when Magnus and his progeny lie dead or dying, and my forces were reduced to a man. I realized how foolish I had been, but it was too late to have regrets now. I like to think that what we started was right, and when reinforcements finally came, it was hardly a comfort. My sons were cut down to less than half now, and the war was far from over. Even though I had practically reached a stalemate of sorts with the Strong Boys, in reality, if they had focused their army more, they could have breached my defenses with little effort. Roice attempted to storm the beaches of Scribble's capital, but most were annihilated before even a single enemy troop could be wounded.
And I wonder.
They took a boat. What do you mean?
Yeah.
They took a boat, dumbass.
I wonder why that happened. I wonder why that happened.
We're at the middle of a war.
They landed. They said, "Where else?" And we're like, "We're dwarves. This is our land."
Why do you think that happened?
Now, with Roice on the front lines, I could go further on the offensive and remove the thorn in my side. I rounded up whatever warriors I could, and in one crushing invasion, I set my sons on a massacre mission. I had hoped better for them. We wanted peace and enlightenment. Now my sons were no more than butchers, philosophers in name only. They were weapons, the weapons my country needed, and were rightfully taking revenge on those who had targeted and retreated from that enlightenment, the light that they showed. They were right to punish those who repaid their kindness with death. It wasn't a secret or revelation, just a shameful truth. Kitty had rejoined the war efforts and promptly destroyed what little foothold I had in the new continent. Back home wasn't much better. My kingdom was falling apart at the seams. Civilians were dying and my host had been decimated. The 1,000 Suns were in ruins. Roice continued his onslaught, waiting for enemy troops to invade his lands to have a home field advantage, while the scouts he had sent were slaughtered to a man. The 1,000 Gilfs were forced to leave their homeland, as my sons had managed to best them despite the direness of the situation. They had attempted to take refuge on my original territory, but with the help of Roice, we managed to beat them back. Kitty and her Ice Kingdom ended up leaving the war prematurely after they had received major casualties during the invasion of the capital of the Pointy Ears. By the time the war was coming to its conclusion, the 1,000 Gilfs were slaughtered down to only around 1950, the center island was functionally a no man's land, where everyone who entered was killed on sight, and my sons and their kingdom had suffered major damage. Once the warriors were exhausted, war simply was no fun anymore. A peace agreement was pushed by Roice, and later the at the time King of the Thousand Suns. Surprisingly, a peace treaty would be signed, and the War of Conquest would finally come to an end. Once the war was over, I spent most of my time trying to recollect my territory, in particular, to re-establish my supply lines and regain my main source of adamantium. However, despite having resistance to fire, most of my land was set ablaze, causing those who either didn't have fire resistance to die horribly, or for the homes we had built to become useless. Understanding that they were simply following the conditions set to them by the Strong Boys, I offered Scribble and his 1,000 gilfs a place among me and Roice as allies. I offered to forgive his previous transgressions in exchange for their support moving forward, an offer he swiftly denied.
Hey,
Looks like the Ice Kingdom's...
How about you join our side, though? I can forgive your previous transgressions. Join us.
Wait, who are you talking to?
I'm talking to you.
Won't you shake a poor sinner's hand?
Shake my hand.
Are you ready?
Man, I swear to God, that movie.
Are you ready?
Wait, crew, is it? Are you able to direct the troops to invade the land?
What the hell is that?
While this happened, Roice rained down greater gifts to his children, bestowing upon them greater luck and with it greater fertility, allowing each family to produce entire broods of offspring. With peace restored and the Age of the Sun coming to a close, it was a time of rebuilding for all those who had taken part in the previous war. However, something had happened which changed the trajectory of everything. Once the sun had finally descended, it never came back up.
Age of Dark?
Fear not, icicle child.
It will be a time of great darkness when the world will be shrouded in a veil of shadows that will seem to swallow all light and hope. Come on.
Can I change my...
Perfect.
I was just...
Can we get a good age, please?
Can we get much higher?
What are you talking about? It's not with Age of Hope.
An age of dark took its place. The world became a plane of endless darkness and turmoil. Light was non-existent, and foul creatures would form out of the very darkness itself, while madness and nightmares became ever rampant. During this transition, the Strong Boys in the Ice Kingdom, which had managed to rebuild their numbers with surprising speed, were empowered by the foul magics that comprised this age, and quickly moved to take advantage. The Orcs, led by Kitty, were the first to act, declaring war on me the moment they had similar military power, and establishing their second colony, sharing the land with Scribble. At the same time, Multiverse and his empire of Orcs would not be far behind, declaring war on me shortly afterwards. Knowing I would not survive, I had no choice but to rely on Roice once again, pleading for him to use his superior numbers to fight the Strong Boys while I battled the Ice Kingdom. He would agree, and thus the Second War of Conquest began only a few years after the first. The war was terrible. War is pain and suffering. These losses, darkness and death, these were the bitterest of deeds. The first to do battle would be Roice and his kingdom of elves, and Multiverse's orcs, who would meet where the original No Man's Land was created during the original War of Conquest. The orcs were still superior in melee combat. However, Roice possessed numbers, as well as a military composed of almost exclusively archers. Despite the orcs being incredibly tough and empowered by the Age of Dark, Roice would push back the initial horde, killing them in vast numbers and even managing to invade their borders. I would be close behind, sending reinforcements. However, due to our boats being destroyed, we had to make the voyage by foot, greatly delaying the speed in which we were able to join our comrades in arms. Seeing an opportunity, Kitty took over the original center, creating 3 new colonies in hopes to use the resources of the land to further her military, as well as remaining neutral to the Pointy Ear Empire, making sure her colonies were left undisturbed during the battle between them and the Strongboys. Despite this, they would still focus their military on me, hoping to expand their options for land, and due to having a population in comparison to my own, it was quite possible they would have succeeded. To make matters worse, they had allied with 1,000 gilfs in hopes the two could split the soon-to-be abandoned land between themselves. Now being settled in the upper regions, the Ice Kingdom's population would explode due to far more abundant food and a friendlier climate. Me and Roice, knowing the dangers that would be a fully realized Ice Kingdom, decided to declare war on the Ice Kingdom as well, starting the second ever World War. Roice would be the vanguard. Now no longer neutral, he would personally destroy the colonies created in No Man's Land, cutting off her supply lines. In the meantime, a massive meteor would crash into the Strongboys' territory, destroying even more of their land and causing a forest fire.
Yeah, you bigot.
Oh my
There's other
God.
places other than America.
Shit! Did I just get hit by a meteor?
Yes, you did.
Yeah. Hey, you got adamantite. You got adamantite.
Luckily for them, it wouldn't kill too many citizens, but it was definitely an omen for what was to come. Now fully deployed and in formation, Roice would make the final push, sending hundreds of his warriors directly into Orc territory. Scribble would attempt to assist, sending a massive bowling ball over the Pointy Ears. However, he would miss.
Sure,
Just do it. Just do it. Yeah. Oh, it went off to the ocean.
Oh boy.
Oh, motherfucker.
It did destroy a part of that.
It destroyed a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, that was a turn.
That was 2 squares destroyed.
Thanks for the help, though.
Why didn't you ask him to put it where his army was?
Now out of options, Multiverse and his orcs would make a final stand, later dubbed the Battle of the Beasts, in which all of Roice's military would battle all the remaining Strongboys on the planet. It was a slaughter. For every single elf the orcs managed to kill, more than 3 of them were killed in turn. Interestingly enough, a measly 3 Strongboys would escape the carnage, leaving the island on a single ship which avoided Roice's eye. I would have congratulated Roice, but there was nothing that I could say that would explain the scale of what he achieved. Upon learning that a few of them had survived, Roice and I would be merciful despite their warmongering, and would give them an option to live, assuming that they no longer threatened us or anyone else.
I gotta make sure. No, the strong boys are still alive.
Oh,
Where?
3 people.
I don't know.
They're somewhere.
You don't have a territory, but there's 3 of you left.
We'll be
Yes!
notified. We'll be notified where they are.
I think you're on a boat or
You know
something.
what? You know what? Call off the aggravation against them. Let them live. Do you accept
Give
we
them-
won?
You have to give Kitty her perks.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Multiverse, do you accept we won?
Do I accept you won?
So that way,
Yes.
I can spare you. Okay, that's fair
Yes,
then.
you, Roice, won.
No,
I
I,
was just there in the
said
background.
we. I said
Yeah.
we, not me.
Yeah, you and your forces won.
Nah.
My people.
Dude, I'm not gonna give somebody else your credit. That's
It's like
not fair to you.
70-30, okay? It's like 70-30. They took down one of your towns, okay? Sure
No.
took down one of your towns.
I took down one of your
You
towns.
took down one of my towns, man. Is mercy established?
Yeah.
Kitty would return as well, but would also call off the war with 1,000 Suns. Thus the 2 wars that took place, dubbed the Sudden Clash and the War of Broken Bones, would come to an end. By the end of the war, the orcs had no foothold or even a city to call a colony. They had created one near my home continent, but was destroyed by my military, leaving just the 3 alive and without a home. Interestingly enough, they would decide to create a new colony right next to my kingdom, much to my anger. But the peace held, and I decided to allow them to exist as long as they did not bother my citizens, as was the agreement. While that was taking place, tragedy would strike again. Another meteor would land directly on top of Kitty's colony, instantly killing 40 citizens and destroying all of the houses in the area.
Yeah, you're doing really
How
good.
much? What was
Elves
the
for the
most
win.
I ever had?
High
What's
fertility
that
rate.
had?
Oh. That just took down like 20 people. Jeez.
Oh
Oh
god.
no! Oh,
That's all
that
the.
took
That's all.
all the houses
The only
Oh.
thing left is the windmill.
and the docks.
I would eventually begin to rebuild and create a new colony, my sons taking a far more aggressive approach to expansion and taking over the original island that once housed the 1,000 Gilfs. Despite the Strong Boys keeping their end of the bargain, it seemed that Roice's people held on to an immense grudge despite their god's judgment and declared war on them. Despite managing to stop them the first time, another war would be announced in which the remaining members of the Strong Boys would be eradicated, leaving no remaining members alive. No chance for recovery.
Sorry. You're bad. Sorry. It was
They're
too
gone.
late.
It happened
Again?
before I even noticed.
Oh, wait. It's 120. It's 120. Is it my turn again? Or
It's oh wait, no, it's not my turn. I just yeah.
It's supposed to be my turn.
It's pointy.
I guess it's my turn then.
It's pointy. You don't exist.
God.
You don't exist.
I want to give my turn to somebody else.
No.
No,
I'm giving it to
goes in order.
Scribble Guy.
It goes in order. It goes in order.
Screw
It goes
you,
in-
man! You declared war on me.
And you're dead.
didn't-
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it goes in order. You get to choose who you want to be part of.
It was your poor time management skills that led to me dying.
Ah, womp womp.
Not womp womp. Oh god. Okay.
Sorry, that was kind of rude.
That was kind of rude. You just massacred children.
I mean, you did that
It was
too.
kind of funny though.
You did that too.
It was kind of funny though.
I didn't kill the kids.
You kind of
Yeah, you did.
Kids killed themselves when they saw us coming.
Oh god.
With the Strong Boys being the second kingdom to crumble, the 1,000 Gilfs in the Ice Kingdom would begin their quest to become superpowers, expanding into the previously inhabited territory and gaining more resources and a higher population. Suddenly, out of nowhere, their territory was also invaded by aliens, a complete turn of events I myself was not expecting, and despite their superior technology, the Ice Kingdom managed to fend them off. The Ice Kingdom even managed to steal their weapons and technology, gaining access to laser pistols, making them, at least in terms of weaponry, one of the most advanced kingdoms in the world. On the other side of the world, with Roice now sharing a border with 1,000 Gilfs, he would declare war against them, with Kitty deciding to defend her longtime ally. Due to their previous transgressions against my people, I would decide to back up Roice, playing my part in the war to come. The final stage was set, and the final war was upon us. The 1,000 Gilfs, being the closest to Roice's territory, would be the first to suffer casualties. His new colony would be destroyed almost immediately, and he would once again be forced to retreat further south. Kitty would suffer even more misfortunes. As soon as the New Age of Hope began, they would be attacked by another invasion of aliens, resulting in major casualties. And to make matters worse, once the aliens had been killed, Roice had already crossed the sea to invade them. Despite fighting hard, their capital city would be left in ruins. I would personally invade their other territory, managing to destroy a decent chunk of their military, along with disrupting their supply lines by destroying their farms. Meanwhile, both Roice and I would begin to expand even further. This allowed for both of us to obtain even more resources and manpower. With an all-out war on the horizon, Roice would focus primarily on the 1,000 Gilfs, hoping to wipe them out prematurely. An effort that would succeed. With a combined assault of the 1,000 Suns, as well as Pointy Ears, the new capital was sacked, and sadly, another kingdom crumbled into nothing.
This is war.
Wow.
This is war.
I think the Gilfs have died.
Oh,
Surprisingly, Kitty took to the offensive, managing to kick off a portion of Roice's army off their main island and re-establish control through a new colony. My sons, along with the Pointy Ears, would meet them in open combat and would be victorious, defeating them, forcing them to migrate to the last colony, where they did a heroic last stand. Strangely enough, it would be a single champion of Roice's army who would finish off the remaining members, having taken one of their advanced weapons and utilizing it against them.
Oh, they now died.
Oh my god.
Fucking laser gun!
Oh my gosh.
What the fuck?
This ultimately sealed Kitty's fate, with the final member managing to keep the battle going for nearly an entire month before finally being killed. At the end of the final war of conquest, the military between me and Roice ceased fire and put all of their remaining resources into expansion and technological innovation. A lot of damage was done after the battle. Hundreds were lost, towns were destroyed, and many forests were burned to the ground. And despite our victory, it was bittersweet at best. My sons were forced into dire circumstance, and war after war, so it was, with a hint of relief that peace was finally established. However, when remembering everything that we had done to get to this point, it was still bittersweet, with knowing that we had ultimately become butchers and weapons in hopes to simply survive. This thought weighed heavily on my sons, and even though the golden age of enlightenment that they so heavenly craved finally came to pass, it was still a bittersweet story. Roice would celebrate his victory, and peace would finally be reached indefinitely. And it is here that our story finally ends. Well, that's the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. This was a bit of an experimental one because I am a very bad storyteller, so I thought I'd do this as a bit of practice. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe. If you didn't like it, why are you still watching? It's been nearly 30 minutes. Thanks so much to my patrons, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Bye.